allowing me to speak. So purifying and enlivening for me to be able to speak, and it does a lot more good for me, I think, than anybody else. So thank you, and I'd like to thank Ajitesh Prabhu for that kirtan. That was Ajitesh is the real deal. He really is. Every way, he's got bhakti all around him. So. Om Jnanatamurandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurmilitam Jena Tasmai Sri Gurue Namaha. I was born in the darkness of ignorance, but my spiritual master has opened my eyes with the torchlight of knowledge. I offer my humble obeisances unto him. So tonight I wanted to talk about positivity in spiritual life and positivity in general. What does that mean for us? How do we have a good attitude? How do we approach spirituality and approach our lives in such a way that we have a positive experience, a wonderful experience? Because that's ultimately what every living entity is looking for a wonderful experience, looking to have an experience that satisfies them and that makes them feel happy. So I talk to a lot of people, distribute books, go to the campus and meet people around. And one of the things I find, one serious theme that I find, is that the mind is a big challenge for most people. Most people struggle very, very hard with the mind. And Krishna confirms this in the 15th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. He says that the living entity is struggling with the 6 senses, which include the mind. So everybody seems to be struggling with their mind because the mind is basically forms our reality. The mind is the basis of our reality. And so if we have good thoughts, we generally have a good life. If we have bad thoughts, we generally have a pretty negative life. So one of the main principles of yoga is to control the mind. This is actually what yoga means. Yoga means to control the mind and thus connect to God, to bypass the mental interference, which is stopping our perception of Krishna, stopping our perception of the reality, which is God consciousness. So much of yoga is meant to control the mind. And yoga is like a ladder. Krishna describes a ladder. And then the top of that ladder is this bhakti yoga process, which is what we're practicing here, this chanting, this eating of blessed food, and this hearing of sacred literatures and sacred wisdom allows one to elevate themselves to the highest stage of yoga and thus control the mind. Krishna describes in the Bhagavad Gita that the mind can either act as the best friend of the living entity or the eternal enemy, the worst enemy. So that's kind of our choice, whether we want to live with the friend or the enemy. And based on our choices, based on our actions, and based most importantly on our desires, we can choose to have the enemy mind or the friend mind. So most people, unfortunately, are living with the enemy, the mind which is causing insecurity, causing envy, causing jealousy, causing so many unnatural and uncomfortable emotions and experiences. And therefore, we see that in the world today, there's so much mental illness. Mental illness is the biggest problem we have that we're facing right now, that there's so much more mental illness than there used to be because people are having a very hard time coping with and dealing with their own thoughts and emotions. And this is, we're talking about spirituality, we're talking about yoga, but just on a practical level, a person's ability to handle their own thoughts and emotions determines their quality of life and determines how successful they're going to be in anything they do. So it's so important that people understand and have the ability to handle their own thoughts and emotions. So this process of bhakti yoga is given by the Lord so that the living entity can handle the thoughts and emotions, and not just that, but to elevate themselves spiritually to the highest level of consciousness. So it's like a little scientific look at things. When I'm distributing books, I go out to the campus and I distribute transcendental books about meditation, spirituality, yoga, Srila Prabhupada's books. And one of the things I ask people a lot is, do you believe in karma? And most people say yes. And so I say, well, this is the first book ever written on karma. This is the original book on karma, Bhagavad Gita, which some of you just got. And they say, oh, I'm interested. But some say, no, I don't believe in karma. And I say, why is that? And they say, well, I just never really thought about it. So I explained that. Isaac Newton, he explains that for every action, there's an opposite or equal reaction. And Jesus Christ, he says, as you sow, so shall you reap. So karma is a universal law. And people can understand that, especially college students. They can understand scientifically that for every action, there's a reaction. Well, I tell them, what about things you do? What about thoughts? You can measure a thought. A thought has energy. That's a fact. Therefore, every thought you have has a reaction. So that's pretty heavy when you begin to think about that. If we actually just take science, every thought you're having has a reaction. So the quality of our thoughts, once again, is going to determine the quality of our life. So it's so important, if we desire to have a happy life, to understand and control and have a peaceful mind. So with that being said, so many new age gurus and self-help people are speaking about and putting forward this idea of positivity, positive thinking. We should think positively. Think positive and manifest your reality. We hear this so much. Anybody who's kind of walked down that road is going to hear a very predominant idea that positive thinking is the solution to our mental problems. And that's true, but unfortunately, the vast majority of the world doesn't understand what is positive and what is negative. Because we understand from the Vedic paradigm and from the theological basis of the Vedic scriptures that this material world is essentially a place of suffering. It's a place of pain. We're eternal living entities. That's the basic spiritual knowledge that Krishna speaks in the Bhagavad Gita. Never was there a time when you do not exist. Never will there be a time when you'll cease to be. So that's basic spiritual knowledge. And the living entity finds himself in different bodies and different lifetimes, at different times and places and circumstances. And when the living entity comes into this world which we live in, this material world, Krishna explains that this place is a place of suffering. It's like a prison house. It's a place where the living entities are sent because their consciousness is not quite right. And they have a serious misconception of themselves and a serious problem with envy and selfishness. And that's why we find there's so much war in the world. There's so much anger in the world. There's so much conflict. Is because the living entities in this world come here for that purpose. And the goal of life is not to get as much sense gratification, as much toys, as much pleasure as possible. That's what most people think the goal of life is. And because of that, they're constantly finding themselves in material perplexities. They're up for some time, they're down for some time, they're up for some time, they're down for some time. But when the living entity realizes the purpose of this life, the purpose of this world, and then utilizes his facilities and his energies in such a way to fulfill that purpose, he finds deep satisfaction. The Srimad Bhagavatam says, Savai pum sampara dharmo yatto bhakti ardhoksaje aitu kyapratiyata yayatma suprasidati. That the supreme dharma, the paradharma for all human beings, is that by which they can attain loving devotional service unto God, unmotivated and uninterrupted. And that loving service, that will completely satisfy the self, yayatma suprasidati. That will give one complete self-satisfaction. So, bhakti yoga adhoksaje, that bhakti yoga unto the supreme transcendental Lord, that is our solution to this problem. So, like I was explaining, everything is perception. What we think of as positive might be negative. What we think of as negative might be positive, because we live in a temporary relative world. Krishna explains, nasato vidyate bhavo, nabhavo vidyate sataha. That which is eternal cannot be changed. The soul can't be changed. And that which is temporary, the body, is always changing. So everything in relation to this body, the ideas, the countries, the conceptions, the politics, whatever it may be, the relationships, if they're based on the bodily platform, they're all temporary. And therefore they can't enliven, they can't gratify, and they can't satisfy the eternal soul within. Therefore, the living entities are wandering the material cosmos, seeking a deeper sense of satisfaction. And because they don't understand this reality, they're constantly bewildered and entangled. because what they think is a positive action may in fact be a negative action based on their level of consciousness. Here's an example. So most people generally understand that drugs are, essentially entangling, essentially degrading to the consciousness, and not so good. But for the living entity who's addicted to drugs, that's a positive thing because it gives one high. It gives one something that, it's perceived to feel good. Although it's perceived to feel good, someone in a higher level of consciousness can understand that even though it feels good, it's ultimately degrading to the living entity. It's ultimately entangling and causes a lot more trouble in the future. So once again, you see that there's this relative positivity based on what I think or what I perceive is positive and what I perceive is negative. So in that way, the living entity, based on his mental concoctions, on what he thinks is positive, what he thinks is negative, he's wandering around the material universe, entangled and entrapped, sometimes going up, sometimes going down, dealing with so much karma. So this behooves one to approach a higher level of authority or a higher sense of knowledge in order to escape or to extricate ourselves from the material world. We have to approach knowledge which is outside the world, or transcendental knowledge. So that is the point at which spiritual life begins, is that when someone approaches higher knowledge which is coming from the transcendental world, which is coming from living entities who aren't entangled. So the Supreme Lord, he's never entangled in the material energy because he's the master of the material energy. He's the master of the spiritual energy also. So therefore, the Supreme Lord can never become entangled in that material energy. And the Supreme Lord says, Yada yada hidarmasya ganar bhavati bharataha. He says that I'm appearing different places in different times to give you knowledge by which you can extricate yourself from the material energy. So the Lord is coming from outside of time and space, entering into the material world and providing knowledge that is suitable to allow the living entity to cross the ocean of material entanglement. In other words, the Lord is giving you what is really positive, not what is perceived to be positive for some time and what may be negative at a later time. So Krishna, he appears in the world and he explains that this material world is a place of temporal duality, and that the living entities that are trying to enjoy such facilities are suffering due to positive and negative reactions. And that when one accepts that reality or that basis, that this world is kind of a place of temporal suffering, but the purpose of the world is to rectify our consciousness. And when we do rectify our consciousness, that truth is very positive. So we hear this word illusion a lot, and generally that's translated from the word Maya. Maya means that which is not. So the material energy is that which is not. It's temporal. And so when we're gaining our information and when we're formulating our life path based on material energy, based on our mental material concoctions, what happens is we are ultimately living a lie. And so many people in the world are living a lie. They think I'm this body. That's the first misconception. That I'm American, I'm Indian, I'm Hindu, Christian, I'm Jewish, I'm gay, I'm straight, I'm a this, I'm a that. And so they hold on to this material conception of themselves in an attempt to make themselves happy. And that because I'm going to be satisfied as this. So although that may feel positive for some time, because it's a lie, because it's an illusion, ultimately it's negative. So sometimes, people can accuse the devotees, we're up here and we're saying, the world is a place of suffering. And we say, like, you guys are very negative people. Actually, we're not negative because the truth is very positive. The truth is a very positive thing. If I were to tell you, don't go that way, it's very dangerous. Many people have died on that road. They say, well, you're being negative. You're talking bad about that road, that poor road. Well, no. I'm being positive. I'm telling you the truth that if you go down that road, you're going to die. And if you try to enjoy the material energy, you're going to be entangled. It's going to cause suffering. So that's a very positive truth. And if we accept that, it makes our life a lot more positive. you can become a lot more happy because you know the truth, you know the reality, you're not confused. So therefore, the living entity has to humble himself and approach those who have higher knowledge, approach those scriptures and books which contain higher knowledge, and learn this process of bhakti yoga. So the Bhagavad Gita, which is our main text here, one of our main texts, is the Bhagavad means God and Gita means song. So this is Krishna speaking this transcendental knowledge to his friend Arjuna, who's having a serious crisis. And many of you probably know, some of you might not, the Bhagavad Gita takes place on a battlefield. A very, very serious situation is going on. Arjuna, the prince, is having to face his family in a fraternal war. And he gives Krishna all these reasons why he shouldn't fight. Even though the other side they're very, very degraded people and they shouldn't rule, and they're tyrannical. And so as a warrior, it's Arjuna's duty to stop them. But at the same time, he gives all these very good reasons not to fight. If I fight, I'm going to be entangled in karma. If I fight, how am I going to enjoy? How am I going to be happy having to fight like this? But Krishna enlightens him in transcendental knowledge and explains that, no, it's your duty to fight. It's your spiritual duty. It's what I'm asking you to do. And so we want to follow the instructions of God. That's going to create the highest, the most positive atmosphere for us. So Arjuna, he came to this point where he realized, by my material knowledge, because he's trying to understand the situation by all this material knowledge, and Krishna is just sitting there. And then he comes to this point, he says this verse, he says, now I become confused about my duty and have become bewildered due to miserly weakness. In this state, I am asking you to tell me for certain what is best for me. Now I am your disciple and a soul surrendered unto you. Please instruct me. So Arjuna is coming to that point of humility. He's coming to that point that we all have to come to. He can't figure out this suffering with his material knowledge. Therefore, he approaches Krishna for higher knowledge. And he says, now instruct me. So all of us are kind of in the same boat as Arjuna, whether we're on a battlefield or whether it's our families or our jobs or our lives or our emotions. We are struggling to deal with the reality in which we live. And so Krishna explains that the first sign of someone with intelligence is humility. And that humility means to approach higher knowledge in a submissive way and therefore accept that higher knowledge and thus extricate ourselves from the material suffering. So Arjuna had that wisdom to approach higher knowledge and then be enlightened into what is real positivity. So how does that all relate back to the mind? As Krishna, he begins to speak. First off, he says, those speaking learned words, because Arjuna was giving so many reasons why he didn't want to engage in bhakti yoga. And Krishna says, those speaking learned words, the wise lament neither for the living nor the dead, and you're mourning for that which is not worthy of grief. So Krishna is acknowledging that Arjuna is wise, that he was speaking learned words, that someone can have so much intelligence, material qualification, doctorates, degrees, everything. But because they don't have knowledge from outside of time and space, all that knowledge is relative, it ultimately won't satisfy or solve the issues that the living entity is facing, which is suffering of the mind, and ultimately birth, death, old age, disease, and the repetition of that through reincarnation. So we have to accept knowledge from the transcendental world. That comes through the form of the Vedic literatures, through the form of the devotees of the Lord, and through the form of the representative or spiritual master, bona fide guru. So Arjuna was wise enough to approach and accept that transcendental literature. And Krishna then instructs him in the Bhagavad Gita, instructs him in this elaborate science of bhakti yoga, and explains all these beautiful statements of wisdom. But the final statement, the final conclusion, is that he says this beautiful verse. He says, "Man mana bhava mad bhakto mad yaji mam namaskuru mameva shashi shatyam te pratijani priyosi me." He says, this is the ultimate way to control the mind. Always think of me, become my devotee, worship me and offer your homage unto me. In this way you will come to me without fail. I promise you this because you're my very dear friend. And this is a very beautiful statement by Krishna, because ultimately he's saying that the highest reality and the highest way to control the mind, ultimately the most positive thought we can have, is love. That the mind, when we're trying to control the mind by force, no one can do that. Arjuna says it's harder than controlling the wind. But when the mind is controlled by love, it becomes very, very easy. And so Krishna is the most positive person, most positive object, most positive reality there is. And that's the message, that God is the most positive thing, and the most exciting and wonderful reality we can live in is that reality which is connected to Krishna. That's called Krishna consciousness. And so because of Krishna's qualities, if one engages in bhakti yoga literally means the yoga of love, or the yoga of loving devotion to the Lord. One gets to know Krishna, the Supreme Lord, in such a profound way that the mind becomes naturally controlled and naturally focused on positivity. Because when you love someone, you can't help but think about them. So someone who engages in bhakti yoga has a relationship with Krishna, and therefore they're always thinking of Krishna. They're worshiping and serving Krishna. They're bowing down before Krishna, showing reverence to Krishna. In that way, they become fully absorbed in God, and therefore they're always positive. Even when the greatest calamities strike, you'll find that the devotees are always positive. And our Srimad Bhagavatam demonstrates this. And Prahlad Maharaj was a small boy. They attempted to murder him many times. His father was demoniac and tried to murder him many times. He was always happy. He was always blissful, just surrendered to the Lord. And because he was so surrendered, the Lord protected him in every circumstance. Arjuna's mother, Queen Kunti, they had such a challenging life, immense challenges. And after it was all finished, she told Krishna, she said, I hope these calamities can befall me again and again, because in each of these calamities, I simply remembered you, and you appeared. And therefore, they were amazing. They were actually good for me because I can have this relationship with you. So that's what we're talking about when we say transcendental, that relationship with Krishna is transcendental, beyond the pain that we're experiencing within our mind and our emotions. So that solution of always thinking of Krishna is the ultimate positivity. There's so many more things I can say, but the ultimate positive solution is to focus our mind on God. That's real positivity, because God is beyond the dualities of this material world. And so how do we do that? That's what we teach. This is what this whole place is about, is what is the practical process for actually fixing your mind on the Lord. So the Lord has so many beautiful activities. Every living entity is attracted to hearing stories, or every human being at least is attracted to hearing stories of other human beings. They like to watch TV shows. They like to read novels. This is common, everybody, all cultures around the world. So the Lord appears and performs beautiful pastimes of love, or beautiful activities of love that are not only pleasing to hear, just like any other story, but they are transcendental because they deal with the Lord. And they have a certain transcendental quality that if one hears these pastimes of the Lord, or these activities of the Lord, one becomes enlivened and enlightened in spiritual life. Krishna says, Janma karma cha me divyam evam yo viditat vata tvaktva deham punar janma naiti ma meti sarjuna. He says, simply by understanding my activities. So I remember when I first started coming here, I was kind of amazed that God has activities. Well, you have activities. How could God not have activities? Everything that exists in this world also has to exist in God. So yes, God has activities, but God's activities are beautiful. They're superb. They're sublime. And so he comes to this world and demonstrates his activities so that we can hear them. So one can hear by reading. We have all these beautiful books you can take. You can hear about the pastimes and the activities of God. Everybody's inclined to love and to have attachment. So we don't say attachment is bad. We say become attached to Krishna. If you become attached to Krishna, everything will make sense. All the other attachments will relax, and you'll see things in their proper perspective. Everybody has friends and people. Whether those people are uplifting us or degrading us, that's up to us. But the devotees of the Lord, they're meant to help us remember Krishna. So you become friends, you form your relationships with the Lord's devotees, and the Lord's devotees always remind you of Krishna. And therefore, your social circle becomes positive. And everybody likes music. But most people think of music and meditation as a separate thing. But we do music. We do the highest form of meditation is kirtan, which is what we were just doing, Ajitesh's beautiful kirtan. So you do kirtan. You come and you chant the Lord's holy names. Nice musical. It's so blissful. You do it for a while, you'll feel so much happiness. And therefore, you're thinking of Krishna. And all your relationships, they become Krishnaized. So I'll end with this. That this bhakti yoga is so powerful that if one develops the consciousness of doing service and pleasing Krishna, if that's the consciousness of a bhakti yogi, how do I please my beloved? Then that literally nourishes every aspect of our lives, our relationships, our jobs, whatever it may be, it's nourished because we have to do it in such a way that pleases Krishna. So whether you're interacting with someone in love or in conflict, if you're thinking, how is this going to please Krishna? How am I going to best please Krishna in this circumstance? That really affects us in a profound way of what we're going to say, how we're going to deal with people, how we're going to treat other people, how we're going to respond to conflict. And it allows us to have the most positive and beautiful outlook. And Krishna says, he says, Mam cha yovya vyacharena bhakti yogena sevate sagunan samatit yaitan brahma bhuya yakalpate. He says that if you engage in this bhakti yoga constantly, seriously, then you'll surpass all of the material energy, all of the modes of material nature, and you'll be situated on the spiritual platform, Brahman. So it's a very, very wonderful process. If there's any questions or comments, please shoot them out. I see a hand over there from Bhakta Nick, but he's behind the pillar. He's got to come out like Lord Nrsingadev.
Thank you for another enlightening class, Prabhu. I was just wondering, with like a monk like yourself or the householder, if you could say something about the role that you're speaking of, if we at some point have to become like a monk like you or attaining that goal.
The ultimate goal is love of Krishna. That's our spiritual goal, is to love Krishna. So there's, depending on the person, the place, the circumstance, it may be positive for someone to become a monk, and it may not be. It may be positive for someone to have a household. It may be positive for someone to do something in a different way than I do things, as long as, of course, under proper guidance. But the ultimate goal is love of Krishna. So, we don't have to change so much. There's certain things we have to change. We have to stop doing things that are blatantly negative. One of those things is like intoxication, meat eating, those things, they cause a lot of negativity in our lives. So we let those things go. But ultimately, the process of hearing, chanting, remembering Krishna, that bhakti yoga process, that will lead us to love of Krishna. So our goal is love of Krishna. And under proper guidance and under, proper guidance, we take guidance from each other, and we take guidance from our superiors in bhakti yoga. And in that way, we will, come to find what works best for us to attain that goal of love of Krishna. So that's what we're really talking about. The goal is to love Krishna. Yeah. Any other? We can take one more. There is one more. Parameshwar Prabhu.
Appreciate your utilizing your good intelligence in Krishna service. Nice example of applying Bhagavad Gita. Very nice scholarly class. Just have a thought. You mentioned all about the positivity and kind of with hearing the pastimes of Krishna. Are you all okay with me distributing the Krishna book? It's considered the best part of the greatest book in the universe. Anybody that wants one, and whatever you give goes to the temple. And you know this, you're okay with it. You're okay with that.
So if anybody wants a Krishna book,
it's the most, it really It's literally considered the greatest, the enlightened beings call the Srimad Bhagavatam the greatest book in the universe. And it culminates in this one book called the Krishna book. It's all filled with Krishna's pastimes. I listen to it or hear it at least like pretty much all the enormous amount of time. Like spiritual masters have read it over 100 times. It's ever increasingly devotion. And that'll really, really, really get you immediately to positivity. You can be in the worst mood, and within 2 or 3 sentences, you're completely put it totally works. Vyasadeva is the compiler of the Vedas, and the spiritual master chastised him for not giving us the topmost thing. And then he wrote the Krishna book, basically. It's Srimad Bhagavatam, which is the Krishna book that makes the best part.
So if anybody wants a Krishna book, which is all these beautiful activities of God, you can just approach Parameshwar Prabhu. He's pretty hard to.
I'll be right here with the Krishna book. We gotta get him with my name. So
yeah.
There in about 10 minutes.
Approach him.
10 minutes after the book.
Thank you all so much. Hare Krishna. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.